Welcome to worship at Bart Centenary United Methodist Church in Littlestown, Pennsylvania. I'm your pastor, Tammy Blos, and I'm so glad that you joined us this morning. Our text today is Exodus chapter 1, verse 8 through chapter 2, verse 10. Now, a new king came to power in Egypt, who didn't know Joseph. He said to his people, "The Israelite people are now larger in number and stronger than we are. Come on, let's be smart and deal with them. Otherwise, they will grow in number, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and then escape from the land." As a result, the Egyptians put foremen of forced work gangs over the Israelites to harass them with hard work. They had built storage cities named Pithom and Ramesses for Pharaoh, but the more they were oppressed, the more they grew and spread. So much so, the Egyptians started to look at the Israelites with disgust and dread. So the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites. They made their lives miserable with hard labor, making mortar and bricks, doing field work, and by forcing them to do all kinds of other cruel work. The king of Egypt spoke to two Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah. When you are helping the Hebrew women give birth and you see a baby being born, if it's a boy, kill him, and if it's a girl, you can let her live. Now, the two midwives respected God, so they did not obey the Egyptian king's order. Instead, they let the baby boys live. So the king of Egypt called the two midwives and said to them, "Why are you doing this? Why are you letting the baby boys live?" The two midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because Hebrew women aren't like Egyptian women. They're much stronger. They give birth before any midwives can get to them." So God treated the midwives well, and the people kept on multiplying and became very strong. And because the midwives respected God, God gave them households of their own. Then Pharaoh gave an order to all his people: "Throw every baby boy born to the Hebrews into the Nile River, but you can let all the girls live." Now a man from Levi's household married a Levite woman. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that the baby was healthy and beautiful, so she hid him for 3 months. When she couldn't hide him any longer, she took a reed basket and sealed it up with black tar. She put the child inside the basket, and she set the basket among the reeds at the riverbank. The baby's older sister stood watch nearby to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, while her women servants walked along beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent one of her servants to bring it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child. The boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. She said, "This must be one of the Hebrews' children." Then the baby's sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Would you like me to go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter agreed. "Yes, do that." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I'll pay you for your work." So the woman took the child and nursed it. After the child had grown up, she brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I pulled him out of the water." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The first part of Genesis told us the story of God and the human race. The second part of Genesis told us the story of God and the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who was renamed Israel. Exodus is the story of yet another transition in the promise that God made to this family. When Joseph, Israel's son, invites all of Israel's grown offspring and their families, they settle in Egypt as a family. You might even soon call them a clan. But in the 400 years they spend there, they become so much more. They become a nation. And Exodus is the story of God and the nation of Israel, a nation that is born without a land. I came across this interesting fact sheet on another local pastor's Facebook page. Thank you, Reverend Fritz. It just so happens that 400 years have gone by since Joseph gave that invitation to his family. And this particular fact sheet gives us a little bit of an idea about how many Israelites, the offspring of Israel, his sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters, down to the 9th great-grandchildren, are now living off the resources of Egypt. The sheet indicates that there are 4,094 ancestors for every one person over 12 generations, and that 12 generations span about 400 years. The text just before our text today says it like this: the total number in Jacob's family was 70, but the Israelites were fertile and became populous. They multiplied and grew dramatically, filling the whole land. Now, you may have noticed that that very leader is in parts of today's text referred to as the king of Egypt, and in other parts of today's text, he's referred to as Pharaoh. Now, this may indicate that the written version we have received comes from more than one source of oral history. Scholars believe that the pharaoh indicated here would most likely have been Ramesses II, who reigned between 1290 and 1224 BCE. And he is remembered as an extraordinary builder. Now, why is the pharaoh Ramesses II so worried about the number of Israelites? Maybe because he knew his own history. It seems that Asian invaders had controlled Egypt, dominating the eastern delta between 1780 and 1570 BCE, until they were finally overthrown by the Egyptians. The memory of these foreign overlords is enough to create a healthy wariness of the growing population of foreigners. And so the Egyptian response to this fear and the growing reliance upon these foreigners to meet the labor needs of Pharaoh and his love of building is a slow escalation of oppression that the Egyptians place upon the Israelites, whom they call the Hebrews. Once honored guests, Israel's descendants are demoted to feudal peasants and later demoted again into slaves, until even this oppression escalates to infanticide. Now, this is a foundational text for the Israelites. And because of that, there are several interesting midrash around it. One of them says this: the rabbis say that God accused Pharaoh of being stupid as well as wicked. If a shrewd king wanted to get rid of a whole nation of people, he would kill all the female babies rather than the males. After all, it is the women who give birth to and nurture any nation. But it wasn't just Pharaoh's miscalculation that could have been thwarting his efforts. There also was the influence of the midwives that he originally set to the task. They provide Israel with the first glimmer of resistance against Egyptian tyranny. Shifra, which means beautiful, and Pua, which means fragrant flower, are either Hebrew women who are midwives to other Hebrew women, or they are Egyptian women who have been assigned as Hebrew midwives. But either way, they have been fully converted to God, and they are clearly in opposition with Pharaoh on this matter, and they are willing to subvert his will. By the time we get to the Moses narrative, there are already healthy amounts of discontent rumbling from Israel's descendants. We know that every nation has heroes in their founding stories, even childhood stories of these important figures. In our own history, we have Little George and an honest report about his cherry tree. It is also interesting that quite a few great leaders, such as Gandhi, Ho Chi Minh, and Lenin, were separated from their people for a time of education, only to later return and lead a revolution. Of these great leaders, it seems that Moses may have been among the first. In Israel's founding narrative, we find a people under tyrannical rule that has been twisted to the point of murdering infants. And then we get our first glimpse of our founding hero, a beautiful, healthy baby boy who's hidden for the first 3 months of his life until it became too difficult to hide him. A last chance plan is hatched. A watertight floating basket is made and hidden in the very river which babies are being drowned in. A big sister is set to stand watch. One of Pharaoh's daughters, and sources say that Ramesses actually had 59 daughters, but one of them went down to the river to bathe that day with several of her servants. And this was the very spot which Sister Miriam, probably not so coincidentally, chose to place baby Moses and his watertight basket. Now, this is a place in the story where another midrash exists. These are extra, sometimes imaginative explanations, tales, and commentaries that have been collected from various rabbis throughout history. And this midrash says the rabbis tell that Pharaoh's daughter suffered from leprosy, which is one reason that she had to come to the river to bathe. But as soon as she touched the basket in which tiny Moses lay, she was healed. So she took pity on the baby and took him into her father's house. Now, whether this midrash is a valid explanation of the motives behind this daughter of Pharaoh or not, the text tells us that Moses was taken in by Pharaoh's daughter. Sister Miriam makes herself known at just the right time and offers to get someone to nurse the child. And before we know it, baby Moses is going back home with his own family until he is weaned, and he will be adopted afterward. The family is no longer forced to hide Moses, but is instead now being paid to take care of him. And despite his slave status, Moses will have access to a royal upbringing. So, what does this reveal to us about Israel's future leader? What does this founding story teach us? Well, we know for sure that Moses is favored by God. His story shows God's influence from the very start, even in a time when all the cards are stacked against him. God protects and provides a loving early home. He provides a first-rate education and physical provision, even when most are suffering. He has been chosen, set apart, and set up to be prepared to do the will of God for God's people in the future. What does this reveal about Israel? We learn that God has not forgotten Israel. Israel continues to be favored by God. They have been chosen. They have been set apart. They have been set up. Despite what their present circumstances might depict, they have been set up to be prepared to do the will of God for the good of God's people in the future. So, what do we learn about God and ourselves in this text? Why do we include this in our sacred text? Why did God include it? Well, we learn something about ourselves and about God too. Through Jesus Christ, we too have been chosen. We too have been set apart. We too have been set up to be prepared to do the will of God for the good of God's people right now and in the future. Amen and amen.